All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to finally be finishing the Romanticism note sheet. As you'll recall from previous lectures, we have a lot of different notes here on Romanticism. We have the general Romanticism notes on both British and American and Pan-European Romanticism. Later we talked about the Knickerbocker School, early American Romanticism, early American Nationalism. We followed that up with Transcendentalism in the unit on Emerson and company. And now we're on the last part of American Romanticism leading up to the American Civil War. So Romanticism dies a very quick death in 1861. You can even see this in the lives of individual authors. So for example, a clear example of this particular phenomenon would be Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, early on, in the early editions of Leaves of Grass, we see all of the transcendentalist optimism, individualism, so on and so forth. But when we read Drum Taps, his book of Civil War poetry, we see a very conscious move towards realism in terms of both genre and, we could say, epistemic mode in that particular period of intellectual history, of American aesthetic history, that we call realism, which will be the next unit we cover in this particular class, in this particular American literature survey. But today we're going to go over the general notes that I want you guys to be aware of with regards to the American Gothic or Gothic American literature, or sometimes called dark Romanticism. This is roughly from the period of late 1840s moving into the period right before the American Civil War. It's a relatively short period, but it's where we see a really big explosion in major American authors. These are the authors you'll see talked about as the authors of the so-called American Renaissance. This will be Hawthorne, this will be Poe, this will be Melville. All of your big names are writing during this particular period. Emily Dickinson, we can also group her in as a Gothic author. We'll do a couple of lectures on her, though I find her poetry less genial than some others. But in any case, we see this very conscious turn towards the Gothic aesthetic, towards an aesthetic that was already popular in England, not say about 70 years prior, not quite 100 years, but in 1760s, 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, we see the Gothic become very popular in Europe, and most particularly in England. It comes to America a little bit later, and in the American context, the revival of the Gothic aesthetic has a lot to do with our particular literary mode, our particular aesthetic history, and it's primarily a response to Emerson. So I've made this claim in previous videos, you've probably heard me say it. All American literature after Emerson publishes Nature for the next 100 years, from then until really about World War II, is a response to Emerson. I genuinely believe this. And what we see in the Gothic is the first wave, and quite frankly, I would say the most intense wave of backlash we have against transcendentalism, against Emersonian optimism. And so what do we see in the Gothic? Like all literary movements, and we've talked about this, like everything in intellectual history, there is a reaction to, and there's a borrowing from. So there are some consistencies with what comes before in terms of transcendentalism, in terms of Knickerbocker School, but there are also some contradictions. There are some also very self-conscious reactions against, and in particular, reactions against transcendentalism. Because as you may be aware, Hawthorne's a clear example of this. Orestes Bronson's another clear example of this. Hawthorne's wife, Sophia Peabody, is another clear example of this. We see many of the authors in the Gothic are former transcendentalists. They get involved in transcendentalism some way, they get their feet wet, but they don't jump into the pool. And later, they react very harshly against the transcendentalist aesthetic, against the transcendentalist mode. And the way of reacting against that is through the Gothic aesthetic. This is something I'm going to talk a lot about. If you watch the next video, which will be on the vocab, you'll see I talk a lot about the emergence of horror as a genre, horror as something new, and horror as a fundamentally conservative or traditionalist or reactionary aesthetic. What most horror deals with is what happens when progress goes wrong. What happens when we unleash the human passions and they come to destroy us. It deals with, and this is the fundamental thing we want to discuss for this movement, the idea of return of the repressed. And we can see this expressed a little bit in the famous Goya painting, The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. It says right here in Spanish, El sueño de la razón produce monstruos. El sueño de la razón produce monstruos. The sleep of reason produces monsters. And the idea is Emerson and company were wrong about the Enlightenment. So the Gothic thinkers do agree that human beings are primarily irrational. We see this in Hawthorne, we see this in Melville, we see this in Poe. We are moved by dark forces. There is some sense pre-Freud, sort of Freudianism or psychoanalysis avant la lettre, there is some sense that there is darkness within our unconscious, that we have sinful drives and desires, that human beings are not born innately good, that essentially there is the existence of an id, and also of a superego, which is irrational and self-destructive as much as the id is irrational and self-destructive. And the rational ego that we put forward, the Ben Franklin personality, is maybe only 5% of all the psychic forces that are going on within us. This is a very common theme in Gothic literature more generally, but you see this super well developed, really in all of the major authors we're going to discuss in this unit. It comes up in Hawthorne, who has a very Augustinian way of looking at the human mind. We see it in Melville, we see it in Poe. And this shouldn't be totally surprising to say that Hawthorne sees things in a very Orthodox Christian, traditionalist Augustinian lens, and also seems to believe in the existence of an unconscious. It's actually really only in the Enlightenment that we get the idea that human beings are completely rational, completely ordered, that children are innocent, so on and so forth. Many modern Christians, I would say, under the influence of modernity, under the influence of the Enlightenment, because quite frankly, most Christians, their worldview is not derived from Christianity. Their worldview is liberalism, the sort of atmospheric, ambiental liberalism that we all live in, with a Christian veneer. And so as a result of that, like your average everyday Christian, Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, they believe that children are fundamentally innocent. They have this idea that, life is just going to get better and better, that people are fundamentally rational, so on and so forth. And they look at someone with Freud with intense suspicion. And this, I think, is a mistake. I'll just point this out here. One of my favorite authors, someone I am translating, someone whose works you can find translated on this channel, available for free, is Father Leonardo Castellani, who is a Argentine Jesuit priest, was writing in the 20th century. He's one of my absolute favorite authors of all times. And he actually has a really great book on Freud where he has the famous quote, what's good in Freud is not new, and what's new in Freud is not good. So Castellani really thought the new ideas in Freud, like the Oedipus complex, he thought that's not a universal psychological phenomena, that's mostly just stupidity. But he did think, hey, the existence of an unconscious and the fact that children express very profound, deep, powerful, sinful drives that are violent, that are self-destructive, that are sexual, so on and so forth. Castellani, even as a very, very Orthodox Catholic, in fact, one author says his orthodoxy was bulletproof. He knew every heresy. He knew every possible way he could be interpreted as being unorthodox, heterodox, so on and so forth, and avoided it, and actually managed to make some really interesting claims while doing it. But Castellani's basic point is, St. Augustine would have read a lot of what Freud wrote and said, yeah, that's very consistent with what I believe to be true about original sin. Freud would say that's just the nature of the psyche. St. Augustine would say that's just the nature of the human heart after the fall. But they both agree that human beings are not fundamentally rational and these drives exist. And we see that same thing coming up, as I mentioned, in Hawthorne, in Melville, and in Poe. Where is this coming from in intellectual history? Well, it's a reaction to the Enlightenment. It's a reaction against the Ben Franklin idea that human beings are fundamentally good, that we have a rational mind, that we can just order everything and put it in its proper place. And you see this even in the aesthetic of the neoclassical, of the Enlightenment. You listen to a piece by Mozart, you do not see the dynamism of something like Wagner. And in fact, that's an exercise I'll put on this channel, but it's an exercise I recommend to all my students. When I would teach this class, for the past 5 years, I always did a day where we would look at a piece by Mozart and then we would compare to the Tannhäuser Overture of Wagner. Because if you listen to the Tannhäuser Overture, you hear the dynamism, the grandeur, the intense emotions that are present in human life. You feel that the psyche is not something totally irrational. Whereas Mozart's worldview is like a well-ordered garden. Everything in its proper place, there's no wilderness, everything has moderation, everything expresses restraint, everything is perfectly rational. Wagner does not show that. And in fact, another great Wagner opera, if you listen to, would that be the overture of Tristan and Isolde, in that overture you have the famous note where, again, I'm not going to express it properly, I'm not a music person, but we get one of the first instances of atonality, and you hear something off in that one famous note right in the opening of Tristan and Isolde, which is there to express the fact that we are going to be dealing with an illicit love that defies the rational order. We are going to be dealing with a human passion that defies the rational order, that is sinful, that is, in every possible way, irrational. Well, where are we getting that from? The Romantics have a clear sense that the human mind is not rational. However, here's the difference. Emerson agreed with this, and the Transcendentalists agree with this. So if you look at Emerson's great essay, Prudence, in the first series, Emerson's like, yeah, don't act with prudence, act based on impulse, self-actualize yourself. As long as you are self-reliant and you follow all your impulses and you express authenticity, you march to the beat of your own drummer, as Emerson famously says in Self-Reliance, you will lift up the veil of Maya, you will become the transparent eyeball, you will realize that all things are the oversoul, you will become a spiritually enlightened being. Or more to the point, you will realize that you already are the most spiritually enlightened being. You're the oversoul, you're the monad, you're the one, you're the absolute. This is Emerson's idea. And Emerson's very optimistic about this. He really believes that if we are ourselves, if we're true to ourselves, if we act on the basis of intuition rather than on reason, rather than on like using our rational capacity as human beings to achieve particular ends, if we just follow the deeper intuition, the world will become a better place. Well, not so in the Gothic writers. The Gothic writers actually view this as satanic, as something very evil. And you see this most clearly in Hawthorne. In fact, I can't wait to get to the Hawthorne stories and start teaching them again. But what we see is human beings acting on impulse is actually quite scary. Even though the Gothic writers agree that human beings are not fundamentally rational, they say that's actually what's scary about human beings, is that we need reason. And the sleep of reason produces monsters. If we put reason to bed, as the Transcendentalists did, what we will get is violence, bloodshed, and horror. If we put reason to bed fully, and we only leave the unconscious drives, if we just act on intuition, what we will get is horror. We will get something truly monstrous. And so the Gothic writers agree the Enlightenment view is not sustainable, but they actually say we do need to bring reason back into the picture. It's a reaction against the reaction, which is why it's reactionary, which is why it's very traditionalist and conservative in nature. It's no. This romantic project of following our passions has gone too far. If we listen to Emerson, later Nietzsche, Emerson being the American Nietzsche, we are going to overstep our bounds, and something really bad and really scary is going to happen. And that's expressed by the horror that's present in these stories, which is always a punishing force, which is allegorically representative, usage of allegory, which we'll talk about in a minute, for these instinctual drives that are within the human being. So a clear example of this, let's actually talk about allegory. The clearest example of this will be when we take a look at the most famous Gothic story of all time in the American context, Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. Yes, it's a haunted house. That's true. But the haunted house in Edgar Allan Poe is allegorically representative of a human mind that is haunted. What is it haunted by? I'm going to spoil it, so skip this if you don't want to hear it. But also remember, there's no such thing as spoilers in literature class. We're here to study the text. We're not here to enjoy them the way you enjoy, I don't know, a Stephen King novel, right? We're here to break them down and analyze them. But the point is, the house is representative of the sinful desires of Roderick Usher because Roderick Usher has an incestuous desire towards his sibling, Madeline Usher. And that incestuous desire is implied many times, is acted upon. We can get into that when we analyze the story. But that haunted house is the haunted mind of he has let this instinctual libidinal desire be expressed, and the result of that is intense horror. The result of that is something truly terrifying. That's through allegory. Now, why the revival of allegory? We don't see allegory in Transcendentalism. We certainly don't see allegory in the Knickerbocker School, which is more about sketches and poems. Where do we see this revival of allegory in all the Gothic authors? Well, the revival of allegory has a lot to do with the fact that the Gothic authors, like many Romantic authors, you see this in British first-generation Romanticism, where Coleridge and Wordsworth, Sir Walter Scott, they're all looking back to the medieval past. The idea for those first-generation British Romantic authors is, wow, the medieval English Catholic past was something truly beautiful. Not because we're Catholics, because actually they don't really have anything in common with the Catholic worldview, but instead because that was a time when humanity was innocent and childlike. And now we're rational and we're sober and we're adults, but that's a bad thing. We don't want to be sober adults. In the American context, the looking back towards medieval forms, medieval worldviews, medieval settings has a lot to do with nostalgia and has a lot to do with this idea of return of the repressed. What is return of the repressed? The thing you don't want to think about will come back to haunt you. What is return of the repressed? The thing you don't want to think about will come back to haunt you. If you do not assimilate reality as it actually is, reality will eventually come to you. It will come in a horrifying form, and it will come to avenge. It will come to destroy you. You can't deny nature. You will experience the wrath of the Arañes. Nature will find you. Nature will show you its true form that you wish to deny, and you will have to suffer for it. So the clearest example of this in modern horror films, you can see in Scream, classic slasher movie. What's the plot of Scream? We all know the Scream has the rules of scary movies, and if you fornicate or take drugs, you will die. Well, what's the deal with that? It's Return of the Repressed. We live in a society where those are considered victimless crimes. Taking drugs, drinking at a party, no problem. That's no worries. It's not a crime. You're just having fun. You're having a good time. You're being young. You're in your teens. You're in your 20s. It's all good. Well, the unconscious knows those things are not good to be doing. There's no such thing as a victimless crime. Those are bad. And even if you're not going to be legally punished for them, there are societal consequences, there are interpersonal consequences, there are psychological consequences to those actions. And so what is happening is you get the wrath of the Arañes, you get the return of nature, you get the return of the repressed. The thing you didn't want to think about, oh, it's fine, I'm just here to have a good time, boop, comes back. The repression of that idea will come back and it will haunt you. Another clear example of this, great horror film, I Know What You Did Last Summer. It opens with like this beach orgy where everyone is having fun, drinking, having a good time, smoking marijuana, so on and so forth. And then on the way home, they hit someone and they say, we're going to pretend this never happened. And it turns out the person they hit lives, comes back to try to kill all of them. What's the idea there? There's no such thing as a victimless crime. You knew you shouldn't have been doing that. You knew that life is just not about pleasure, having fun, and hedonism. And now the very thing you sought to ignore is coming back to kill you. What is the thing we seek to ignore on a societal level in the American context? Well, it's the fact that America is a society without history, that America is an experiment, that in the European context there have been no stable democracies for longer than 50 years, that we belong to a civilizational pact which involved Catholicism, which involved the monarchies, which involved this entire system that has lasted over 1,000 years, which has connections back to Rome, so on and so forth. And America wants to say all of that is tyrannical and we are going to forget about all of that. We're going to forget about our European heritage. Well, you can't forget about your heritage. You can't forget where you came from. It's just like the Bob Marley song, Exodus. We know where we're going. We know where we're from. If you know where you're from, you'll know where you're going. Well, America collectively has decided to forget where it's from. And as a result, America does not know where it's going. Now, the Enlightenment thinkers and the Knickerbocker School thinkers wanted to say, that's a good thing. We will create history out of whole cloth. The Gothic writers are super skeptical of this claim. You'll see this especially in Hawthorne. Hawthorne, I don't know how, there are some scholars who agree with me, but there are most scholars will actually disagree with me on this. I think Hawthorne thought the American Revolution was a truly horrific thing. Most scholars say, no, Hawthorne's just whatever. We'll get into that with Hawthorne. But you'll see this in Hawthorne, as Hawthorne is effectively saying, we have repressed the actual truth of the American Revolution. And as a result of that repression, there must be horror. There must be some sort of consequence. And so where is allegory coming from, to go back to the original question? It's going back to this medieval form. And the reason why we see a return in Poe and Hawthorne and Melville of medieval settings, of medieval ways of thinking, of medieval characters, is precisely because it's Return of the Repressed. All of those authors are dealing with, collectively, what have we as Americans repressed? What are the things that we as Americans do not want to acknowledge about our European past, about European tradition, about religion, about politics, about democracy? All of those things that we don't want to acknowledge will come back to destroy us. Okay? Very basic Gothic presupposition. Now, I know I've covered a lot. If you have questions about any of that, leave a comment down below. I'd be happy to clarify. And as always, just leave, I like when people leave nice comments. If you enjoy the video, it actually means a lot to me if you leave a comment. I read all of them, so feel free to do that as well. Okay, we've covered the first point, and we've talked a little bit about the use of allegory. We see borrows from the Graveyard School of English Poetry. Again, this is 1760s, 1770s, 1780s. You get a lot of mostly pretty bad English poetry that takes place in graveyards. It's about death, it's about melancholy, it's about skulls, so on and so forth. If you go back to Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, Emmeline Grangerford, the dead girl who wrote all the poetry and made all the paintings, Twain is making fun of the graveyard school of poetry. Because if you didn't catch this, one of the big underlying themes in Huckleberry Finn is making fun of all forms of romanticism. Whether we're talking about Gothic, as taking life too seriously, as being ridiculous, as being over the top, whether we're talking about transcendentalism, whether we're talking a little bit about the Knickerbocker School, Twain basically makes fun of all romanticism. Most particularly European romanticism, but American romanticism as well. And so Twain makes fun of the graveyard school of poetry, but the graveyard school of poetry is a big inspiration for a lot of the Gothic writers, both in the British context and in the American context. And those themes of the graveyard school of poetry are going to come up in a lot of the authors we read, most particularly Edgar Allan Poe. The influence on Poe, I think, is where you see this most clearly. We have European Gothic motifs the European Gothic motifs that we see in the novels of the 1770s, 1780s in England. So old decaying mansion, female in peril, incest trope, doppelgangers or doubles, the anti-Catholic emphasis in the saving male. Now, where are these things coming from? Why do we associate these things with the Gothic? Because we can have a horrifying setting, for an example, an abandoned orphanage. But an abandoned orphanage is a fitting setting for horror, but it's not specifically Gothic. When we think of Gothic, we're always thinking of medieval elements like Fall of the House of Usher, an abandoned aristocratic mansion. Or what would be Mask of the Red Death is another clear example. It takes place in an abandoned monastery. Why do we associate these elements with the Gothic? And why are they such fitting elements for horror? I mean, if you think about it, in the Middle Ages, the Lord's house was the safest place. It was the place that was protected by soldiers, by the knights. And so the Lord was representative of safety. It was seen as like a home, like a hearth type of image. Similarly with the monastery, monasteries were incredibly safe places. If you were a criminal, you could flee to a monastery. The monks kept life peaceful, kept life ordered. Why are those seen as horrific things? The answer is, and this is quite interesting, it really comes from the fact that the Gothic emerges as an aesthetic in England. There's a great Spanish literary critic, one who I admire a lot, even when I disagree with him, by the name of Jesus G. Maestro. You can find all of his videos on YouTube. It's Jesus G. Maestro. In English, Jesus G. Master, which is kind of funny. People have made fun of him for that. But he's a phenomenal literary critic. He's from Spain. And he actually made a video where he talks a little bit about the Gothic. And he says, horror is not a Spanish aesthetic. We don't see horror come as a genre in Spain until the late 19th century. Really until after 1898, for obvious reasons in Spain. But the point is, like, this Gothic 18th century novel shows up nowhere in Spain. It's not popular in Spain. And it's actually not popular in a lot of places. It's popular in Germany, but it's not popular in France. It's not popular in Portugal. It really picks up in popularity in England. Well, in the 18th century, why would English people come to see monasteries and castles and abandoned aristocratic homes as being fitting sites for horror? Well, horror in the Gothic, as I've mentioned, is a very traditional and conservative genre that deals with the weight of history, that deals with the history that we all want to forget about, Return of the Repressed. Well, what do English people want to forget about? Let's ask ourselves this. Go back to the time of Edward VI, the seizure of the monasteries, the raping of the nuns, the kicking out of the monks. Everyone knows that this happened. Mass executions, mass rapes, the stripping of the altars, as Eamon Duffy says. Well, the stripping of the altars was the removal of this particular tradition. And what happened to the monastery's properties and the church properties, which there were numerous, right? People forget the church used to own farms and mines. The Catholic Church was not just like church property. People think, oh, it was churches and monasteries. Yeah, but it was also these enormous plantations and landed estates and mines and all these different all these different natural resources like forests. When all those properties are seized by the English government, they create new peerage, they create new gentry, and they say, you are now, whatever, the lord of this. And they create essentially a new and aristocratic title out of thin air to reward people who are loyal to the regime. It's kind of like you buy a house, it's a steal. You get it for $110,000 and it's 4 bedrooms in this economy. But then you find out that, whatever, the family that lived there before, they were all murdered and the dad committed suicide. You go, okay, well, now the weight of history is inside of that house. Do you really want that house? You become an aristocrat. Hooray, this is amazing. You're a gentry. You're part of the upper class. Problem, you become an aristocrat because, all the nuns were raped and the monks were killed and you inherit their property. Oh, the weight of history. So what are we repressing? Return of the repressed. Oh, it's fine. We can take the property. Catholicism bad. Catholicism backwards. That has nothing to do with English tradition. Everything's fine. Everything's good. The reform, this, that, the other. Return of the repressed, pop goes the weasel. It has to come back. You cannot keep things repressed forever. The truth comes back. Wrath of the Araignées. Return of nature. You shouldn't have done that. And you know you shouldn't have done that. And so as a result of that, all those properties now become sites of haunting. Now they become sites of things that are quite terrifying in the British context. Now, I know that some people won't like that explanation. I think it's better than Jesus Hey Maestro's explanation. His explanation is basically the English invent the Gothic and horror because the English are cowards. I think that's a weak explanation. But obviously my explanation has a Catholic twist to it. I'm obviously Catholic. I think that's quite literally what happened. But I challenge anyone to come up with a better explanation for why those sites become the sites of horror and why we associate those things with being Gothic. The reason why you get novels in England like The Castle of Otranto or The Monk is because those sites are seen as sites of horror because they contain the repressed history of the English people that the English people self-consciously want to forget. Why do we see the return now of the medieval in the American context? Because the medieval represents the collective history of the American past that the American people want to forget. No, Yankee Doodle, progress, American Revolution good, democracy good. We have nothing to do with monarchy. We have nothing to do with Catholicism. We have nothing to do with this old worldview. Okay, fine. But why does it haunt you? Why do you see in Poe, when those settings return, you find them so scary? I would say Return of the Repressed, which is the central aesthetic element in the Gothic aesthetic. If you have questions on that, put them down in the comments. But this is my theory. Good. So European Gothic motifs present, allusions to medieval romances, again, medievalism revival, an attempt to illustrate the darker side of humanity. To show we are not self-contained rational beings that act like automatons and are trying to economize on scarce resources. We're not born tabula rasa all good. There is some deep taint in human nature. Now, there's a discrepancy between the Gothic authors as to how deep that taint goes. For example, Herman Melville is going to say, I think quite frankly in Moby Dick, is that it's like pure Gnosticism. This universe is purely evil and human beings are purely evil. There's only evil in the human heart. It's total depravity returning all over again, but in a different context, in a secular context, because Melville was not religious really in any way. In fact, quite frankly, Moby Dick is a blasphemous novel. I don't know why so many traditional Christians love that novel. It's a great novel. You should read it, even as a traditional Catholic, Christian, Orthodox, whatever. But the novel itself is blasphemous. I mean, it's Ahab is trying to kill God fundamentally, and we'll talk about that when we get to Moby Dick. We can do a lot of videos on Moby Dick. And so Melville's view, much more sinister view of human nature. Hawthorne is more, as I said, Augustinian. Human beings are deeply flawed, but they're still capable of reason. They're still capable of good action. There are still miracles that happen. And so we range from human being has a stain, much like original sin, to human beings are totally depraved. But what the Gothic authors are not going to say is human beings are born rational, progress is inevitable, life is just going to get better and better. And even if you think about the historical material conditions of America in the 1850s, 1860s, it's very obvious that life is just not going to keep getting better and better. We're going to have this enormous bloody civil war, brother against brother, 2% of the population dying. Everyone knows that it's coming. You can feel it in the air. There is a change in the psychosphere, so to speak. Americans have a sense that the day of doom is coming. The day of reckoning is coming. And that this idea that America is just going to be upwards progress and we're going to liberate all the nations and free them for liberalism and democracy, maybe that's not going to work out. And maybe Emerson was wrong about just following our impulses, because maybe following our impulses is going to lead to horror. This is the Gothic in a nutshell. I have covered what I wanted to talk about with this Gothic note sheet. Hope you found this video useful. Like and subscribe if you did. Leave comments below, please. I love reading comments. Also, feel free to check out, I have below in the description, my college degree accelerator program. I have been working on it a lot over the past month. We've got some really good stuff. Material for many different AP exams, a whole study plan designed whether you're a sophomore in high school, a junior in high school, senior in high school, freshman going into college, to help you graduate college faster, to help you graduate college as fast as 2 years, which is indeed possible because I myself did it. I graduated college at 19. I created this program for people who want to do the same. Go give it a look in the description. I think you'll find it's quite interesting. Anyway, hope you found this video helpful. Take care, and I will see you all in the next lecture.